Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to my presentation on additive manufacturing of nuclear spacer grid. My name is Syed. I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, the Department of Mechanical Engineering. So today we're going to talk about the additive manufacturing of nuclear spacer grids. And before we dive into more details, let's take care of a few background things. First of all, let's talk about nuclear spacer grids. And so spacer grids are a component of nuclear fuel assembly. As we all can see in the on the left side is fully assembled nuclear fuel assembly. And the spacer grids are the straps that goes around this assembly and holds the nuclear fuel rods in place. On the right side, we can see a cutout section of the nuclear of the spacer grid. For our convenience, we have a fuel rod, a demo fuel rod inserted in the spacer grids. So there are, and on further right, we see a single cell of the nuclear spacer grids. And one of the main features, or a couple of main features of this spacer grid is the spring and dimple features. They're responsible for holding the nuclear fuel rods in place. So that's nuclear spacer grids. The size of each spacer grid is, so this is 1/4. The size that's shown on the cutout is 1/4 the actual size in terms of length. The height is that of the actual spacer grids, and all the other critical dimensions are conserved in this demonstration. So next, let's talk about the motivation to use additive manufacturing or 3D printing for nuclear spacer grids. As you can see, this is data published by one of the major manufacturers of spacer grids, and they show that using the conventional manufacturing techniques, there are a lot of overheads associated with subsequent steps. So spacer grids are extremely thin wall structures in the order of 300 microns. And the way they're conventionally manufactured is by stamping on sheet metals, and then they are hand assembled and welded together to get to the final spacer grid geometry. And as we can see, there are a lot of steps involved, and all these steps can be avoided if we use 3D printing or additive manufacturing, because in additive manufacturing, as we will see shortly, the process is to start off with a CAD model of the final design that we want, and then load that CAD model to the machine and basically print it in one go. So that's the great advantage of using 3D printing, that we can avoid all these multiple steps of fabrication that the conventional grid manufacturing has to go through, and we can get our final product in one major steps. So here we can see the instrument that we used for the experiments that will be shown in the later part of today's presentation. We have used an EOS M290 laser powder fusion systems in our lab here at Carnegie Mellon, and it's called the Next Manufacturing Lab. And the way this process works is we can look at a few major component sections of this system. So the first is the laser scanner and the laser optic system. Then we have a recoater blade. We have the powder beds. One of the reasons why this process is called powder bed fusion, because it's literally the parts are printed on a powder bed on a build plate. So the way it happens is on the build platform, a layer of powder is spread using the recoater blade, and the powder comes from powder dispenser. as the recorder blades move over to the other side, the laser scans over the build platform and creates a single layer. And this process repeats over time, layer upon layer, until we get to the final height of the part that we want. Right, so that's how laser powder bed fusion process works. So it's basically we start off with metal powders instead of rolled metal sheets, which is as opposed to the conventional manufacturing. And we avoid all the stamping, the welding, the cleaning, and the inspection processes because we are basically making the features by melting the metal powders layer upon layer. All right. So this brings to our problem statement and the goal of this project, or basically the goal of this project that we're going to see in today's presentation. First of all, the problem statement is this: that conventional fabrication of nuclear spacer grids require a lot of time and resources due to all the steps that are involved in the fabrication of spacer grids. And our goal is to study if we can use laser powder bed fusion process to minimize that lead time and increase productivity, as well as streamline this process and bring in all the other advantages that additive manufacturing offers. And in particular, in today's presentation, we will be studying the problem that is most obvious and one of the fundamental problems in laser powder bed fusion process, which is the buckling of thin wall structures. As we have mentioned before, this spacer grid structures are extremely thin walled and they are tall compared to their thickness. So this brings the obvious problem of buckling, type deformation, which is very common in laser powder bed fusion process. So basically today we're going to study the this fundamental problem in additive manufacturing, particularly in metal additive manufacturing, and we will see the different mode of bucklings that we see very often, and we'll also present some simulation results on this process, and eventually we'll lay out our future work and how we're going to solve that problem. So let's talk about our experimental workflow. And for this work, we begin with a simplified spacer grid design. And then we do two things. One, we fabricate these simplified structures of spacer grids. And then we also simulate them. And eventually, we compare our fabrication and simulation results with the original CAD model to see how dimensionally close we are to our original design. So let's go through them one by one. First, simplified spacer grid design. What is simplification? What kind of simplification do we make? So when we say it is a simplified design, we mean that a couple of complex features that we have seen in previous slides, such as the spring and the dimple feature, are excluded from the spacer grid model. And this simplification is done because as we are familiar with the LPBF process, we've seen in the past that fabricating tall and thin wall structures is always a fundamental challenge for this LPBF process. That's why our goal was first to fabricate something that is not too complicated, but also preserve a lot of critical dimensions of the actual spacer grid. For example, in our simplification, we still keep the wall thickness to 300 micron, which is very close to what the original design is. We maintain the height of the spacer grids, which is around 47 millimeter, which is also the actual height of nuclear spacer grids. We preserve the individual cell sizes, and so the only simplifications that we have made here is we have excluded the spring and dimple features from the wall. So in the next slide, we will see the fabricated part. So we used, as we mentioned earlier, we used EOS M290 for fabrication of these parts. And the material that was used is Inconel 718. This material is the same material that is also used for conventional spacer grid fabrication, in addition to a couple of other materials. But this is definitely one of the materials that is frequently used in spacer grade fabrication. And the fabrication parameters that were chosen were all the standard Inconel 718 parameters. And we did not make any variation of parameters at this point yet. So our very first build was a reduced height build of the spacer grids. We went for the reduced height build because, like I've mentioned before, fabrication of tall thin wall structures is a challenge, and we wanted to make sure that we go step by step just to make sure that we are doing everything correct and all our strategies are working for the fabrication of these parts. So we went through these steps. We started with a reduced height build of 12.5 millimeter, which is about 1/2 inches. And then after successful fabrication of the reduced height parts, we went for the full height build of the spacer grids. And we also introduced, so the original design thickness of the parts were 300 micron, but we also introduced an additional 500 micron part just to make sure that we are actually able to fabricate them successfully, because there is a great chance that the 300 micron part could have easily failed. Excuse me. So then, after the successful fabrication of these parts, using these two different wall thicknesses, we have scanned them using a Zeiss Comet 6 3D scanner, and we have inspected the scanned STLs by comparing them against our CAD models. So at this point, in addition to the 300 micron wall thickness and 500 micron wall thickness, we lowered our wall thickness to 200 micron even, which is not the STL of which is not shown here, but we will see the result of that print in a subsequent slide. So at this point, we have fabricated our simple spacer grid structures with 200, 300, and 500 micron wall thicknesses. And we have scanned them using a 3D scanner. We have got the STL files of those fabricated builds. Now we're going to compare them with the original CAD models. And after we have compared them with the original CAD models, what we see is that there is great deviation. There is large deviation from the CAD models. Now let me explain a little bit of what we are seeing on this slide. So on the left post, we have a 200 micron wall thickness part, which is fabricated and then compared against the CAD model. And as we can see, the contour plots that shows the deviation of these parts, and we would see a lot of in and out of surface buckling or large deformations with a very high frequency, and magnitude. The middle portion, we see the 300 micron wall thickness part compared against its CAD counterpart, and we see there are large bumps, and also there are some large deformation and buckling. But one of the things to note is that the frequency of buckling is much less in the 300 micron wall thickness part than observed in the 200 micron wall thickness part. And in the 500 micron wall thickness part, we see there is an overall shrinkage of the part indicated by the bluish color of the part, but there is no large out of plane deformation, which is very encouraging. But we have to remember that our requirement for this particular application is to be able to print 300 micron wall thickness parts. So we still got some work to do there. But some overall comment on this plot is that we see a bluish color of the contour plots, which indicates that it's very typical of laser powder bed fusion process, that there is an overall shrinkage of the parts. We see some alternating red and blue colors, which indicates that there are in and out of plane deformation, which we are calling buckling here, of these thin wall structures. Then in the next few slides, we'll take a look at some particular measurements of deviation along a section we choose. So we're basically taking the worst case scenario for every deformation cases. I mean the worst possible deformation scenario of a given wall thickness part. So we're basically choosing one of the cells and taking the deviation measurements along the height of that part and plotting them against the height. As shown in this graph, what we're seeing here is our three different wall thickness parts: 300, 500, and 200 micron wall thickness parts. The fabricated using laser powder bed fusion process and then scanned, and the scanned STL is compared with the CAD model, and these are the deviation data that we get. So as was pretty evident from our contour plots, we see a very high frequency buckling in the 200 micron wall thickness part, and then we see a lower frequency but still large out of plane deformation for the 300 micron wall thickness part. But as indicated in the contour plot, we don't see a lot of large deformation on the 500 micron wall thickness, although there is some. If we look at this gap from the 0 point to this point, we still see some overall shrinkage that was indicated by the overall bluish color. But in the 500 micron wall thickness, there is no big overall deformation. There is no big buckling type deformation present. So the next we'll see the results of numerical simulation of the 200 micron wall thickness part, and we will compare the deviations obtained by the numerical simulation with the deviations obtained from the experimental part, which is the real deviation. So as we can see, in the 200 micron part, which was experimentally found to deviate at a very higher frequency, we can see that the numerical simulation was not able to pick up the exact frequency, but still it showed some correspondences in the large deviation. This curve will make more sense when we look at a couple of deviation plots later in the presentation, where we will see that the numerical simulation is able to actually model the deviations for greater wall thickness parts. We have to keep in mind that these are extremely unpredictable and highly nonlinear behaviors that we're trying to predict by using this simulation. And we used NetFab's Autodesk's NetFab local simulation for additive manufacturing for performing these simulations. So if this looks bad, then there is some good news with the 300 micron wall thickness, where we can see that there is a very good correspondence between the simulation and the experiments. So we're still investigating where the 200 micron wall thickness simulation does not match that well with the experimental results, and we are figuring out some of the hyperparameters for that simulation, and so that we can model thicknesses below 300 micron. But starting 300 micron wall thickness, it is very much possible to get very good correspondences between simulation and experimental results. as you can see. And these simulations can be very handy particularly for predicting buckling behavior in thin wall structures and finding out the root cause of buckling and how we can prevent them. So the same goes true for the 500 micron wall thickness. We have got very good correspondence between the experimental and simulation results as well. So basically, in conclusions, we can say that we have observed the clear variation of buckling frequency and magnitude with wall thicknesses, although this observation was in a very critical and small range of thicknesses from 200 micron, 300 micron, and 500 micron. We've seen many different variation of buckling frequency and magnitude. In the 200 micron case, we have seen a very high frequency buckling pattern. In the 300 micron, the buckling pattern reduced a little bit. The 500 micron wall thickness, there was no high frequency buckling observed. So this is a critical observation, and this will guide us in designing the spacer grid so that we can maintain the tight tolerances imposed on the spacer grid parts by the nuclear industry. And then we also calibrated our finite element simulation package for predicting the bucklings in this highly nonlinear environments in the 300 micron, the 500 micron wall thicknesses. We're still working on getting the 200 micron wall thickness simulation right. And then in future, it will be part of our future work that we're going to try to use this simulation to get more physical insight into the problem of buckling in thin wall structures and use them in not only in spacer grid fabrication, but everywhere thin wall manufacturing is required. And then we have observed that we need to control the buckling or high magnitude deformation if we want to use additive manufacturing or laser powder bed fusion process in particular to produce nuclear spacer grids. And our future work is going to be that we're working on some of this is work in progress, and also part of our future work is that we're working on some novel solutions to tackle the problem of to tackle the problem of deformation in nuclear spacer grids. We are planning on using some stiffeners and some innovative geometric features on the wall of spacer grids so as not to, and that also without disturbing the critical features that are required for the functionality of the nuclear spacer grids. And that brings us to our next future work, which is to incorporate all the critical features of the original spacer grids for them to work as functional parts in a nuclear reactor. And we are also looking at the issue of cost and performance enhancement that can be achieved by additive manufacturing of nuclear spacer grids. Here are our list of references, and we want to acknowledge ARPA-E for funding this project. Westinghouse Electric is our industrial partner, and we're working very closely. And there is a great amount of tech transfer that's also happening between CMU and Westinghouse regarding this project. We'd like to acknowledge the Next Manufacturing Center, which is our lab at CMU. Penn United Technology is a Westinghouse contractor who provided support for 3D scanning the parts, and Autodesk provided us with the NetFab local simulation software that we used for the simulation of these parts. We're going to publish some of our work are in progress, and we're going to publish these works pretty soon in a journal. In case if you wanted to follow up or you wanted a copy of the preprint or news of the publication, don't hesitate to send me an email, and as soon as we have that published, I will let you know. But thanks very much for taking the time to take a look at our presentation, and any feedback is greatly appreciated. Thanks very much. You all have a great rest of the day.